This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Deepika Bahri in the English department, and I'm very pleased to say that this is my colleague in the department, Professor Salman Rushdie. And it's a pleasure to have him back in our midst for this conversation. Thank you so much for coming back, Salman.
It's getting to be a habit.
Apparently. It's a good one, and we'd like to continue it. We are here today to talk about various things. We're here to talk about, in part, the film version of Midnight's Children. We're here to talk about Salman Rushdie and India. And we're also here to talk about Joseph Anton, which is his memoir, about a period in his life that we should describe as what? Slightly challenging, or I don't know. I think the technical term is one hell of a jam. I know you've been on tour, you've spoken to us before about Joseph Anton, but apparently the reason for the memoir and the occasion for our being here is the fact that there's some trouble with the truth, as you've said yourself. The trouble with the truth is that people don't like it. And that's what happened after the Satanic Verses. Would you tell us a little bit about what the trouble was and how you got yourself in a pickle and a jam?
Oh, that jam. Well, of course, one of the difficulties about this was then and still is that many of the people who declared themselves to be upset did so without needing to read the book in question. And there was the campaign against the book was actually very well organized through mosques and elsewhere, and people were circulated like single sheets of paper with kind of the dirty bits on, you know, and that's what they were supposed to be offended by. And the actual question of looking at those things in the context of fictional characters having opinions rather than the author and so on, nobody bothered to do that. And for a time, I used to get upset about the fact that people were not bothering to read the book, you know. And then it occurred to me that if you look at the history of the big attacks on works of literature, it's almost always the case that the people don't read the book. You know, the people who accused Nabokov of being a pedophile because of Lolita clearly had not looked at this kind of deeply moral and humane book. The people who accused James Joyce of pornography for Ulysses had obviously not read the book, you know, because while James Joyce has many qualities, arousing sexual feelings is probably not one of them. You know? So
darn, they were going to go and read the
yeah,
book.
you know, exactly.
Now
Yeah.
you've ruined it.
I didn't want to disappoint them because it's a really long book, and if you're looking for the dirty bits, they're sort of there at the end, aren't they?
They are
They're
there.
right at
Yeah,
right,
promise.
right at the very end. But you know, it struck me then that it seems to be almost normal when there are these kinds of, let's say, Philistine episodes that people don't feel the need to inform themselves. You know, so that was a difficulty, and I think it still is. I think there's a lot of people have pictures in their mind about what might or might not be in the Satanic Verses. And I mean, I've had several occasions, I've had actually young Muslim men coming up to me admitting that they had been part of the demonstrations against the book, and then saying, but you know, then I read your book and I couldn't see what the fuss was about. And they had been the ones making the fuss, you know, so as I pointed out to them. So that's strange. But I think if you look at it, like, of course, there were some people who did read the book who didn't like it, you know, and I think the kind of serious argument, insofar as there was one, has to do with who has the right to tell a story and who has the right to decide in what terms that story can be told. You know, and I mean, these stories, these so-called grand narratives, you know, of which religion clearly is one, are the stories that we all, whether we're religious or not, you know, these stories are part of our heritage. And you know, my view would be that they belong to all of us, and all of us have the right to tell the story, and all of us have the right to tell the story in any way we choose. You know, respectfully, disrespectfully, comically, satirically, reverentially, you know, depending on our cast of mind. And you could argue that one of the definitions of living in a free society is that we're able to argue about the grand narratives, you know, that we can
And
look...
of which you name politics,
Well,
religion,
nation,
and family.
nation, family, religion. You know, these are the so-called grand narratives that we all live within. You know, and with, and in any open society, there's a constant argument about that. What is the nation? You know, what should a family be? What should our ethical systems or our belief systems be? And over time, that argument changes the grand narrative. You know, there was a point where the grand narrative of the United States included slavery, you know, as a kind of acceptable thing, and clearly that changed. You know, there was a time when the grand narrative of the United States excluded women from the vote, you know? And then that changed because society is an evolving thing. It's a continuing argument. So it seems to me, what happened with this was that somebody decided to say that in the question of religion, it was not open to people to discuss, that people in authority would determine the meaning of the grand narrative and the terms in which it could be discussed.
There was sacred and beyond.
Yeah, and if you didn't toe the line, basically they would come after you, you know, and this is not by any means only happening to me. You know, I mean, in the years following the attack on the Satanic Verses, there were attacks on a very large number of writers across the Muslim world, many of whom were actually killed. I mean, the Nobel laureate Najib Mahfouz in Egypt was, in his 80s, was stabbed in the neck. And, I mean, somehow survived the attack, but still. Another Egyptian secular philosopher, Faraj Foda, was murdered by Islamic radicals. One of the leading secular journalists in Turkey, Ugur Mumcu, was murdered by Islamic radicals. One of the leading Algerian novelists, Tahir Jaout, was murdered by Islamic radicals. And in many, many cases, the allegations made against these individuals were exactly the same as the allegations made against the Satanic Verses. That's to say, blasphemy, heresy, apostasy, these sort of medieval crimes being pursued with modern weaponry. You know? So that's, I mean, that's a short answer. The longer answer is 650 pages long.
And you've said the fatwa was an extreme case of censorship.
Well, it was V.S. Naipaul said it was...
literary criticism.
No, that was V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul said it was an extreme case of literary criticism. And I think he was making a joke. With V.S. Naipaul, you can't always tell. But, no, I think he meant it as a light-hearted way of talking about something serious. Right. You know? But of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini never saw a copy of the book. I mean, he was already very unwell at the time that the book came out. He was already on his deathbed and seeing almost nobody, and certainly not reading 600-page literary novels in English. So the fatwa was, was issued basically on what he was told by his close advisors. And in fact, there is some doubt whether it actually ever happened, because I mean, in Iran, a fatwa is not just something that somebody idly says. It's a legal document, and it's supposed to be written out as a legal document and given under seal and signed and witnessed and so on.
And it's an edict. It's not necessarily a death sentence.
But there is a physical object.
Right.
Whereas, and as far as I know, nobody has ever produced the physical object. I mean, all that happened was that, as I say, the Imam was in his room, in his bedroom, dying. And one of the very few people who was able to have access to him was his son, Ahmad Khomeini. And Ahmad Khomeini went on that day to the television station or the radio station, I forget which, with a typed piece of paper saying, this is the fatwa of the Imam, you must read it. It wasn't signed by Khomeini. But basically they did what they were told.
So that's another story.
So there's a question about, where is it, the fatwa? Nobody's ever seen it.
Wow, I wasn't aware of this. So the consequence is that Valentine's Day, 1989, you receive rather pernicious love letter.
Yeah, it spoiled Valentine's Day for a really long time. Because for a long time, you wouldn't think that religious fanatics were so interested in the massacre and the martyrdom of St. Valentine, but they appeared to remember the anniversary every year, and for a long time it was a moment at which there were kind of renewals of threats and so on, and it took a long time for that to fade away. So yes, I wasn't really enjoying the 14th of February for a long time.
And then several years later, it took you a long time to go back to those years and to be able to talk about them in a memoir that you titled Joseph Anton. Joseph Anton?
Who he?
Yep.
Well, he's made up from Conrad and Chekhov, basically. So the first names of Conrad and Chekhov. And partly it's just because it sounded like it might be a name. There are writers' names that you put together which don't sound like they could exist, I tried out some of those, Vladimir Joyce, probably not. Probably not. But Joseph Anton, I thought that could be a person.
In fact, it is a person. It's a Tyrolean painter.
Yes, but he's got an extra name as well.
He does,
Sebastian. But it's, anyway, we also didn't just invent a name, we invented a backstory for him. He was an international publisher and traveled a great deal.
Which meant he could travel, right?
He traveled a great deal, which meant he was very often absent from the house he was supposed to be living in. And there were people who managed the house for him and so on. So we had a whole narrative. But the reason for the name was, from my point of view, was that I came to feel that in a very odd way, I had fallen into the very different worlds of Conrad and Chekhov. That Chekhov, particularly in his plays, is a great writer of alienation, loneliness, people wanting to be somewhere that they're not. Three sisters yearning for Moscow, stuck in the middle of nowhere. And I thought, yeah, I know what that feels like, And Conrad, partly because, Conrad actually wrote quite a lot about this kind of underworld intrigue, secret agents, spies, etc., not to mention journeys into the hearts of darkness. But also, in particular, I had remembered, a conversation I'd had with Edward Said, Professor Edward Said, great Lebanese intellectual who was an old friend of mine, who was fighting cancer at the time. And he was also a great Conrad scholar, Edward. It's not often known that he really was one of the great scholars of Conrad. And he said that there was this line in Conrad's novel, The Nigger of the Narcissus, which had become a motto for him. This is the moment at which the sailor, James Waite, who was on this ship, the Narcissus, he's essentially dying of TB. And is stuck in a cabin somewhere, and the other members of the crew slightly resent him for being there and being so sick. And one of them sort of goes up and talks to him through the window and says, why do you get on the ship? So, you must have known you were sick. You must have known you were sick when you got on the ship. Why didn't you just stay home? Why do you get on the ship? And he says, it's a famous line of Conrad's. He says, I must live until I die, mustn't I? And Edward said that line, I must live until I die, became for him like a motto that he wanted to go on being Edward Said, and he did with great courage. He went on traveling and lecturing and writing and teaching and so on, and he lived until he died. And I thought, I could take that on from him, really.
Right.
So that was the other reason.
So Joseph comes into being.
But for the reason for doing it, the police I had no interest in having a pseudonym. The police wanted it partly because, we had to have all these houses that were not supposed to be mine, and you needed a name to use, but also because they wanted to train themselves to not use my name by accident when they were like round the corner in the supermarket. They didn't want to say, oh, Salman asked us to pick up some cereal, and then then the cover would be blown,
Right.
So they had to learn a different name. And so they said, choose a name that we can use. Mm-hmm. And so that was really what motivated it.
And I understand they called you Joe.
Which I
at
hate.
times.
I really hated it. I wanted to.
Yeah.
And somebody said to me who read the book, he said, what's the difference? Why do you hate it when it's Joe and not Joseph? They're both not your name. Why is one more awful than the other?
Right.
Which, I mean, it's not logical, is it? But it was actually so that I hated the diminutive. And I was very, very happy when I could kill him.
That means you were getting attached to this name. I want to ask you a couple of questions about that. Because you've said sometimes that literature is a place that I come from. Joseph Anton clearly comes from literature. And yet it's a very, and you've also said that I who make up invent literary characters for a living, have become a literary invention or an invention myself, an invented character myself.
Yeah, not just by me either. One of the things that was happening in those days was that there were all kinds of versions of me kind of floating around. I mean, some of them hostile, some of them supportive. I mean, some of them, let's say, demonizing, some of them idealizing. And I felt about all these. I remember there's this great short story that Borges wrote called Borges and I, in which he makes a distinction between the public person and the private person, And I mean, a number of writers that I know have had that feeling. Graham Greene actually had a double who used to pretend to be him and travel around the world renting hotel rooms and so on and behaving like Graham Greene.
Wow.
And Greene used to try and track him down, never quite met him. But he said he got within 24 hours of him once, that he arrived at a hotel where the other Graham Greene had checked out that morning. So I mean, he wrote very amusingly about this other Graham Greene. Günter Grass used to say that he sometimes had the feeling that there were two people. There was a person called Günter, who all his friends knew and his family knew and his children knew, and was one kind of person. And then there was this person called Grass, who was this public figure and controversial and argumentative and lots of people disliked. And he said, sometimes I feel I can send him out to do the work and I can stay home with my family and friends, So I think that sense of splitting between a public self and a private self, is not unusual. I think especially in these very kind of celebrity-haunted days, I think it's probably quite normal for a lot of people to whom it happens. But it happened to me in this weird way, because I felt that, well, I clearly didn't feel like the demonized version of me, but I sort of also didn't feel like the idealized version of me. There was this attempt to invent me as a kind of Statue of Liberty, And I thought, I don't feel like the Statue of Liberty. And for a start, wrong gender, but I just thought I'm not either of these images of myself, And one of the things that I wanted to try and do in the book is to sort of say that between these two imaginary selves, there's an actual self. There's a sort of human being doing his best.
Right.
Sometimes getting it wrong, sometimes maybe not. But it was very odd to be, as it were, written by other people. To be invented, narrated by other people.
But the person that was made up for you,
Yeah.
in part with your contribution, Joseph Anton, is Joseph Anton dead? You said?
Yes, very
He's dead?
dead. Yes, dead as a doornail. I killed him with great pleasure,
No
slowly and with pain.
No part of you that's still that person?
No, 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 no. Dead, gone, stake through the heart.
A ghost? Is there a ghost?
Yeah, no, like vampire, disappears into ash, and
All
you know.
right.
And the reason is that I never wanted to be. You know, I remember people used to say to me in those days, "Why don't you go live in Australia and have a pseudonym and get on with your life?" And I thought, that's worse than death. I don't want like somebody else's life. I want my life. And what would I do? Never write again? Never see my children? Never see my friends? What is that? So that was the point, was to get back to being able to be myself in an ordinary way. And I think one of the things that most interested me about the end of the story, when I was able to do that, is how easy it was to resume everyday life. Like when all this apparatus of protection and security and so on disappeared, you would think, and it went on for 12 years, you would think that after 12 years of that, it would take a period of adjustment, back to normal life. But I mean, it just was like that. I think, and what it made me feel was that human beings' desire for the ordinary, desire for the everyday, is so profound that when you're offered it back, you just grab it. Yes, please, I'll have that. I started enjoying waiting online. Waiting at the checkout counter in the supermarket. What fun this is, etc. All these things that people don't like, I was really enjoying.
Or I remember somebody asked you in an interview, what would you do if the fatwa were lifted tomorrow? And you said, I would go to a movie.
Did I say that?
You did.
Yeah, well, that's because I was pretending I wasn't going to movies, which in fact I was. No, I mean, see, here's one of the things. So
Give up movies.
No, there's a serious point. One of the things that happened that I learned in all this, I mean, I'm now quite an expert on this security world. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that there's a distinction to be made between what is called threat and what's called risk. Right? Let's say, so threat is the general level of danger that a given person is believed to be in. That's the threat against that person. Risk is how dangerous it is to do a particular thing. So there can be a high level of threat, but a very low level of risk attached to a given. So yes, there's a high level of threat, but if there's a movie theater and you go in 5 minutes after it gets dark and you leave 5 minutes before the lights come up, the level of risk attached to that is very small. Because nobody knows you're going to do it anyway. So it's actually possible, once you learn these distinctions, to begin to reconstruct parts of life. And that's one of the things I used to do. Yes, the police used to take me to the movies. They didn't always like the movies that
you picked.
Yeah. My favorite bit, actually, was a friend of mine once invited me to the opera, to a performance of Rigoletto. And I was in a box, and therefore relatively sheltered, and there's a couple of police officers sitting in front of me who had never been to the opera before, ever. And so when we came out, I said to them, "What did you think? What do you think of the show?" And one of them said, "Bad night for the Hunchback," which came to seem like a wonderful alternative title for Rigoletto. Rigoletto or A Bad Night for the Hunchback.
Well, that's what's really enchanting about Joseph Anton. I mean, apart from fulfilling our curiosity about what happened in those, what was the secret life of Salman Rushdie like, is how much humor there is in.
Well, I often said, my friends and I, when we talked about this, we would say about a lot of things that happen, we'd say that, if it weren't for the fact that this isn't funny at all, it would be quite funny. And I mean, there was again, talking about the police, there was this incident when they took Zafar is now, as you know, he's 33, but he was only 10 or 11 at this time. And they took us to a fun fair kind of weekend, shooting arcades and so on. And he saw one of these shooting galleries, and there was a particular soft toy, stuffed toy on the top shelf, which meant you had to be a really good shot, that he decided, he said, I want that one, Dad. And I thought, I know these things. The rifle sights are all bent and so on. It's kind of impossible to do this. So I was explaining this to him, and then one of the police officers with us, who in the book I give the name of Fat Jack, Fat Jack came up and he said, "What's he want, sir?" And I said, "See that one over there?" He said, "Oh, just leave it with me." And he went and sort of put down his pound, and he was given one of these rifles. And he went, he said, "Okay." And he went, and there's the poor the carny there was going, never seen anybody shoot like that. And he knocked them all down, and then he said, "I think we'll have that one, please." Gave it to Zafar and said, "There you are." So, I mean, so it became quite affectionate, part of it, the relationship with a lot of these police officers.
And
I mean, who would have thought that I would end up having all these friends in the secret police? This was not part of what I thought would happen in my life.
would you catch a pint with them now when you go back?
I
to
do
London?
sometimes. No, when the book came out in England, we had a launch event, and I invited quite a lot of them, and quite a lot of them came. Yeah, drank a lot too.
That's, dated for a brief period and remember it affectionately at a very
Yeah.
difficult time. I found Joseph Anton impossible to put down. And I have any number of friends who've said the same thing to me. It's layered, it's textured, it's funny when I wasn't expecting this to be any kind of a laughing matter. And it's about one of the things I think that you never have turned your back on, which is love.
Mm.
And in
And
fact,
absence of.
your devotion to the idea of love, and I don't just mean personal relationships, and there's that too, but just the idea of love, the idea of loving relationships, love
it's-
of children, books, literature, community.
Well, it's one of the things, when you become the target of an act of hatred, you have to find the opposite in yourself and around you as a way of dealing with it. And I think, for instance, the group of my close friends just closed ranks around me in the most extraordinary way and helped me. There's no question that the reason I'm here in kind of reasonably okay shape and not in an asylum somewhere has to do with the fact that there was this, the love of my friends, really. And I mean, it's in the book, but there was a moment where one of them said to me, at the height of the trouble, the really dangerous time, he said, what your friends are going to do is we're going to form an iron circle around you, and you're going to be able to live inside it. And that's what they did. That's what they did. And what is extraordinary, this is, remember, the world of books. This is the leakiest, gossipiest, worst at keeping secrets, backstabbing, malicious, the most like that of all little worlds that there is. And yet, for 12 years, nobody ever leaked anything. For 12 years, there wasn't a single secret that came out. Not a single person was indiscreet. Nobody.
It's astonishing.
And I mean, there was quite a long period there where things got more settled, and actually I did have a place to live, and gradually my friends, the police began to trust my friends because they saw that these people were actually very reliable and serious people. And so gradually people were allowed to know where I was staying and would come and visit me and so on, just making life a bit more normal and easy. Nobody ever leaked. And it was as if people thought, this is really serious. Don't screw up. And nobody did. I mean, then that's, if you're talking about love, there's a demonstration of it. An incredible collective act of solidarity.
I want to talk about a different kind of love, and this time I want to turn to lifelong love, and I'm talking about India or Bombay. I mean, you call it the city, my city of cities, the city that still makes my heart leap every time I look out the window of an airplane or a train. Still makes your heart leap?
It's a difficult question, that, because, it is the place in India that I feel most deeply connected to. Yes, I mean, that's true. But I think this is, and it's not just a problem of Bombay or Mumbai. It's that something has really changed in India. I think it's really not the place that it used to be. It's become a much more problematic place, particularly in this area of culture. The attacks on cultural artifacts and their makers in India have now become so frequent. I mean, it's like almost every week somebody or other is targeted by this or that group. And there's no defense against it, because the authorities don't stand up for those people when they are attacked, and quite often blame them for having in some way been responsible for the attack against them.
Does that have to do with the media, sensationalism?
No, I think, look, what's happening, you look at India now, you've got 4 major states with ultra-authoritarian regimes. You've got Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, you've got Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu, you have Narendra Modi in Gujarat, and you have the Shiv Sena in Bombay. You have 4 of the biggest, most powerful states in India being run by ultra-authoritarian regimes. And it's quite possible. I mean, I myself am not entirely sure that Narendra Modi will be the BJP candidate for Prime Minister. I'm not entirely sure that that will happen. He may be seen as, I think he'll be a very big figure in the election campaign, no question. Whether he's actually will be the prime ministerial candidate that they put up, I'm not sure about that. I've heard a lot of people in India saying that they think he maybe in the end won't be, because of his very divisive, qualities. But nevertheless, he's a giant figure now in the BJP. And, the risk of that authoritarianism that's already present at the state level moving to the center, is very real. And so on top of that, you have, as I say, this targeting of culture. I mean, I was just there for 2 weeks in India, and in the 10 days, in the 10 days or so that I was there were attacks on 4 different kinds of work. There was Kamal Hassan's movie in Tamil Nadu that was attacked. There was, Ashish Nandi's speech at the Jaipur Festival, which led to, criminal charges against him, and etc. It just seemed like every day somebody or whether it was a scholar or a movie or a book, somebody was being attacked. And in all those cases, the authorities were not on the side of free speech. They were not. They were on the other side.
This in some ways, if you put that up against the emergency, which you've written about.
Well, when I was there, I actually used this term. I said it was a cultural emergency. I said that this was a cultural equivalent in our time of what happened in the mid-'70s. And one of the things that's depressing about it is that people really don't seem to care. There's an enormous degree of the public at large is pretty apathetic about this. Nobody seems to have got the idea that when the freedoms of artists and intellectuals are compromised, so are the freedoms of the people who see those things and listen to those, see those films, read those books, are taught by those professors, whatever. It's not just the freedom of writers to write, it's also the freedom of readers to read. It's the freedom of audiences to watch films. It's the freedom of scholars, of students to listen to scholars. All these freedoms are being compromised in India now, and really nobody seems to care, except a small group of people like me who are involved in the, in that world as practitioners. But other than that, not really. And that really is shocking to me.
Well, what can ordinary people do? Around the time that Joseph Anton came out, you had written a letter to independent booksellers saying, long before politicians, governments stepped up to the plate, it was ordinary people who were working to protect freedom of speech.
Well,
We have a lot of students here. for instance?
Well, you feel that, that it is really in the hands of ordinary people, because it certainly will not happen because politicians decide to do something. That's not going to happen. I think, for instance, in the horrifying case of the gang rape in Delhi, it was very much the fact that ordinary people expressed their outrage, and visibly expressed their outrage by assembling in substantial numbers. That has propelled what will probably be quite serious changes in legislation and so on, to
expedite
the trials, and also to offer, to make the sentencing much harsher, and, to create disincentives, let's say. But there's a lot that remains to be done. For instance, even now, again, the police attitude in India is really horrifying. That I saw a statement by very senior policemen in Delhi saying that if young people were seen gathering in what we call isolated places, that they would be charged with an offense. They would be charged with, if you like, inciting the rape against them. So, young people want to be somewhere quiet to, hold hands or embrace or whatever. They become potentially criminalized. And that's what the police say. So instead of saying this terrible thing has happened, we need to protect young people. Instead of that, there's an attempt to criminalize young people for being young. And the answer to that has to come from public outrage. It's the only place it'll come from. And I hope it will. I found it very shocking that in India you're not allowed to say the girl's name. Her father gave an interview to an English newspaper in which he said he wanted her name to be known, and he actually would like it if the legislation that's being passed would bear her name, as a way of honoring her. Her name is Jyoti Singh Pandey. But in India, you can't say this. You can't say it. It's forbidden information. Right. And not to say her name is a way of forgetting her. It's a way of marginalizing and minimizing her. If somebody has a name, you can remember them. If somebody is nameless, they very rapidly become forgotten.
Right.
So that, I think, is I can say that if I were to just say that, if I had been in India and said her name, I would be possibly charged with an offense. And this is what's happening in India, and it's, I think, important. I speak as somebody who deeply loves India. It's the country where I was born and raised. I've written about it all my life. I speak the languages. I love it. But I do not love what's happening there. And it's, I think, really important to say so.
That might be the kind of love we need more of in India. I've got a lot of other questions for you, but I'm acutely aware that we've only got about 15 minutes to go, and I'm going to guess the audience has questions.
Doesn't time fly when you're having fun?
For you. So if you're interested in asking Professor Rushdie a question, now would be the time to queue up.
There's mics.
And while that's going, all right, very good.
Excuse me, sir.
Could you go to the microphone,
please?
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is very naive. I haven't yet read the book, but what is the aftermath of the demise of Joseph Anton?
Oh, well, this is the aftermath.
The public reaction or repercussions of any kind.
Well, one of the things that I feel happy about is that now that the temperature is down, now that that kind of period of danger and scandal and furor, now that that's over, people are finally able to read the Satanic Verses as a novel, instead of reading it as some kind of hot potato trying to find out where the dirty bits are, And it's finally, it's getting studied a lot and read a lot in universities, and people are, some people love it, some people don't like it, some people quite like it, some people think it's boring, some people think it's funny. In other words, that's the normal life of a book, and it's finally allowed to have that life. You know, it's finally allowed just to find its way as a book amongst other books, you know. And I think, well, I mean, I think that, you know, call me self-centered, but I think that was worth fighting for, you know. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adriana Casal from Mexico, and I have a question for you about now that you're in the world stage and people listen to you, what obligation do you think you have in changing the narrative? What's the reach and impact you think you have? And what's the ultimate message you would like to set in the narrative or change about our current narrative?
Nobody listens to me. They just pretend.
Nobody.
They just, you know, you think I've changed their minds? Well, I mean, what we've been talking about here is an example of that. You know, I think one of the great dangers of having some kind of a public voice is that you're expected to have an opinion about everything, you know? And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be a kind of rent-a-quote, you know? Every time something happens, what's your view, you know? I often don't have a view, you know, or I don't feel that my view is any more informed than anyone else's. You know, I mean, I read the newspapers too, and I have an opinion, you know? Oscar Pistorius, I have a point of view, you know, but there's no point expressing it because it's not informed, you know. So I'm very careful in trying to not sound off about stuff that I feel I don't know anything about, you know. But if I do know something about it, then I do see above, sometimes sound off, you know. But I actually feel there's a danger for a creative artist in being sucked too much into that world. If people begin to see you more as somebody who expresses opinions than as somebody who makes work, it can actually shift the way in which they look at the work you make. You know, they begin to look at it to see what's polemical or argumentative in it, you know. And quite often when you're writing a novel or a story, that it has nothing to do with your intention, you know. So I have quite a lot, I mean, much more than, say, 10 years ago, tried to back away from that, you know, and try and kind of reclaim the space of the imagination, you know, and try and, which was the reason I became a writer wasn't to have political opinions, you know. It was to make things up. And I'm trying to get back to just focusing on that more.
Thank you.
Nikhil?
In Midnight's Children, Salim is motivated to write because he feels his body disintegrating, he feels his time coming to an end.
Yeah.
Do you share a similar motivation to write? You know, a sense of urgency? Or if not,
No,
what
actually, it's a very
motivates
good
you to
question.
write?
It's a very good question, and the answer is yes. I think one of the things that, you know, actually at the time that I wrote Midnight's Children, I really didn't know what that meant. You know, I was a kid, you know, and I started writing Midnight's Children when I was 27 years old. What do you know about death when you're 27 years old? Nothing, you know. Death is a fantasy that happens to other people, you know. I mean, there's a famous story of Woody Allen being asked by a reporter if he liked the idea that he would always live on in his work. And he said, no, I would prefer to live on in my apartment. and, you know, when you're 27, you can have the illusion that that's what you're going to do. When you're 65, you don't have that illusion. You know, you do have a sense of, especially if you're a slow writer. You know, I mean, Midnight's Children took me 5 years to write. The Satanic Verses took me 5 years to write. You know, The Ground Beneath Her Feet took me 5 years to write. And some of the others took 4 or 3 or something, you know, so I'm slow. Which means that the number of books that lies ahead of me is smaller than the number of books that lie behind, you know, and you become very, very aware of that. What it does is something I think which is beneficial. It makes you, first of all, it makes you feel very strongly, don't waste your time. You know, if time is finite, don't mess around. And the second thing is, if the number of books you're going to write is now finite, you better damn well make them the books you really want to write. You know, and so it it focuses your attention in a way that I think is a good thing. You know, so, yeah.
You spoke about being deified by some people and then being demonized by other people. If people actually read your work, how would that reveal you?
Well, one of the things I hope it would reveal is that the books are quite funny. You know, is one of the things that people don't say about the Satanic Verses is that in many places it's comic, you know? And I think one of the worst, if you like, kind of shadows that was cast over my work by the fatwa and so on, is that because the attack on my work was completely humorless and dark and kind of arcane and incomprehensible to many people, people thought that my work must be like that too, that my work must be humorless and dark and arcane and incomprehensible to many people. So somehow the characteristics of the attack on my work were assumed to be the characteristics of my work as well, you know? And I think if you actually read the books, I hope you discover that that's not the case, you know? My friend Martin Amis had a wonderful phrase. He said that what you hope as a writer, what you hope to do as a writer, is to leave behind a shelf of books. You know, you want to be able to say, you know, from here to here, it's me. You know, if you're Dickens, then it's from here to here. It's if you're Seymour, you need more room than there is on the table. But if you're Joyce Carol Oates, you need most of the hall. You know? But that's what you hope, that you just leave. And then, you know, one of the interesting things that happens to writers who are no longer alive is that the chronology of their work ceases to matter. You know, I mean, when you're alive, people are judged by your most recent book or whatever, you know. If you look at the writers of the past, you don't care. You know, you don't think about David Copperfield and Little Dorrit. You don't care what order they come in, you know. And so somehow these books become released from chronology, you know, and they just exist as themselves. And that's, you know, if you're my kind of writer, you're writing books that you hope are built to last, you know, and you hope that generations that succeed you will still find them interesting, you know. And I mean, I won't be around to see it, but I hope it happens. Thanks. Yeah.
As someone with a very personal connection to India, but also having a very unique perspective as an outsider, and more importantly, with an opinion that the public seeks, what is your opinion about the reaction to the gang rape in India? Because rapes have happened before, and they have been happening since.
Yes.
And it seems to me personally that this particular rape incident is almost a hypocritical reaction by the youth of India, because it happened to somebody who wasn't a kid in a village, wasn't 3 girls in a village in Maharashtra who got killed and raped yesterday and were killed in a well.
Yeah.
It's somebody like me, like them, who went to Life of Pi and came back. So, oh my God, it could happen to us. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I wouldn't call it hypocritical. I mean, I think it's not, I mean, it's human nature that if you see something happening to somebody like you, it strikes you, you know. I mean, you're quite right that there have been, this question of gang rapes has been a very big problem for a very long time. And not just, I mean, one of the things that I thought was very wrong in the reaction was the politicians of the right who said that this was a thing that happened, as they said, it happened in India, it didn't happen in Bharat. You know, the idea that this was some kind of a problem of the Anglophone urban middle class and was not a problem of the villagers, you know, not Anglophone, not middle class, which is a complete lie. I mean, it's a profound and important lie that, as you rightly say, these things have been happening in Indian villages every day, and very often happening inside families. You know, it's not, I mean, the case of what happened in Delhi, this is a rape by strangers, you know, but very often what's happening in villages is intra-family rape, rape by fathers, by uncles, by grandparents, by brothers, etc., and completely going unpunished. Or in some cases, village panchayats declaring pathetic sums of compensation, 50 rupees, 500 rupees, to compensate for this life-changing event. And so one of the things that I really got annoyed about was this attempt by the conservative politicians in India to somehow to marginalize this event by saying it only happened to the urban middle class, which it quite clearly does not. I mean, I think there is a problem in Delhi. I think it seems to be happening more in Delhi than elsewhere, but it's happening everywhere else too. In fact, since the famous rape, the Jyoti Singh Pandey rape, there was another gang rape in the northwest of India, which was hardly reported at all. Yeah, hardly reported at all. And so it's clearly a societal problem. I mean, yes, it's true that this one case seemed to capture the imagination or the attention in a way that the others didn't. And you could say that, that that's wrong, but I mean, I'm just glad that something brought this subject to the fore, And what you need now is, yes, you need the legislation. Yes, you need the case to be tried, with all of that, But what you really need is a dialogue of the whole society. You need a dialogue about gender attitudes, And I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening because I don't see any public figure having the courage to lead such a dialogue, and to lead it in a kind of progressive way. Instead, you have a lot of people saying, don't let your daughters go out. Why do you let your daughter go out late at night? Why do they wear blue jeans and mini skirts? What do they expect? The ancient language of criminalizing women for the attacks on them by men, and that really needs to change. And unfortunately, and it's one of the things I was saying about feeling sad about what's happening in India, I don't see that dialogue beginning. Yes, it's there. That is true. It's there in the urban middle class. It's there in the newspapers in the English language, the newspapers and magazines that are published in English in India. I don't see it as there's no political party that's taken it up. Where is Rahul Gandhi? He's talking about wanting to change the country. He's supposed to be a member of this young generation in which this attack took place. Why isn't it his cause? Why isn't it the cause of any other of the younger generation of Indian politicians? That's very worrying. But it's there have been people in India who have said, and I think it's right, that rape is not just an Indian problem. It's a global problem. These things happen in this country too. Maybe not in quite the same way, but there are plenty of rapes, in this country. I think what happened in the case of Jyoti Singh Pandey is that the level of brutality was so extraordinary that it horrified people. I mean, I know somebody who knew one of the doctors who treated her when she was taken to hospital in Delhi, and he said, I really hope she doesn't survive, because the scale of the damage to her body is so great that she will never be able to really live a real life. I mean, there were metal rods thrust up inside her. It was just stunningly barbaric what happened to her. And then you ask yourself, here's this bus in Delhi circling, going round and round and round for hours. Why did no police officer stop that bus? Oh, they said the windows were too high for us to see in. I mean, it's a shocking, shocking thing that happened, and it's right that people were angry about it. But you are right that the anger should be much larger. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is really similar to what she was saying, but how would you explain the contradiction in India about, on one hand, gender inequality, and then on the other hand, that India has had a female prime minister, which is something that the US hasn't seen, that it's very technologically and economically developing. How do you explain that contradiction?
India's contradictory. Some of it has to do with dynasticism, but not all of it. I mean, whatever you think of Mamata Banerjee and Jayalalitha, they don't come from political dynasties. They very much rose to power by their own efforts. I I don't know. There is. I mean, you know. I have no general theory of this. I mean, people have tried to say that it corresponds to the myth of Mother India. You know, that the idea of Bharat Mata. That you can imagine the state as being embodied in a woman. You know, because of this kind of mythology. You know, maybe they're just tougher and nastier than the men. You know. I mean, I think that's sometimes the case. That was certainly the case with Margaret Thatcher. You know, you know, I mean, it was probably the case with Golda Meir. I think you wouldn't want to mess with her. You know, and I think it's pretty much the case with Mamta Banerjee and Jayalalitha. You wouldn't want to mess with them at all. You know, if possible, you back out of the room quickly if they enter. I mean, they're terrifying. And so I think, you know, maybe it's just that. Maybe it's just that there is a rising force of women in politics, but it's not, you know, it's not that many. You know, there are these individual figures who have become very powerful. But if you look at how many women are there in the Lok Sabha, you know, how many women are there in regional governments, it's not that many. You know, so I think it's more like a freak than a theme. You know.
Thank you.
I have two last questions. Go ahead.
Okay.
You talked a lot about free speech, both in Joseph Anton and right now. And since the Satanic Verses were written, there has been a large movement for free speech, especially by students, younger people. But there's also been a movement for political correctness.
Yeah.
How do you think those two balance out? Would you say that now there's much more free speech than there was when you wrote the book? Or do you think there's been kind of an anti-free speech movement that's canceled it out?
Well, I mean, you're right that there have been both movements, you know, and I'm not very good at political correctness, you know, and it's not one of my talents. And I worry about it because sometimes it means that people, for what appear to be virtuous reasons, will espouse the cause of censorship. You know, that and this is, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer briefly because even in the Western societies, different Western countries have different ideas about this. You know, so that, for example, in England, there's a thing called the Race Relations Act, which makes it criminal to make racist remarks, you know, to make sort of racist hate speech. And I lived in England a long time, and I thought, you know, what's wrong with that? Fine, you know. The United States, because of the enormous power of the First Amendment, has a different attitude, which will actually permit racist speech, hate speech, you know, believing, if you like, that freedom is indivisible. If you want to protect the freedom of people that you agree with, you have to protect the freedom of people you don't agree with, you know. And as I say, so there's an argument. If you put a British jurist up against an American First Amendment lawyer, they would have very radically different positions, and both positions would be serious positions. You know, it's not that one is right, the other's wrong. You know, I mean, I've come to believe that the First Amendment position is a more valuable position because it seems to me that reprehensible ideas, unpleasant ideas, racist ideas do not disappear if you forbid their expression. You know, they're still there. And sometimes their force is increased by adding the power of taboo. You know, what forbidden opinion is sometimes more powerful than opinion which is not forbidden. You know, and you sweep this stuff under the carpet, it can actually become bigger under the carpet than it would out in the light of day. And so I've come to feel, while I understand the position of people who would ban hate speech and so on, you know, I've come to feel that it's sort of better out than in. I'd rather know who thinks that and be able to argue against them and point to them for what they are, rather than have them doing it in kind of hole in the corner way, you know, underground, which I think potentially can be more dangerous to a society, you know. But no, I mean, my view is, I'm not, I mean, your question's about PC, and I'm the wrong person to ask about that.
Good afternoon, Professor. So you've repeatedly expressed your happiness that Joseph Anton is dead and buried, but was there a period of time during your exile that you had genuine concerns about this going on till the end of your life, you never managing to break through that cycle, and how did you reconcile that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I did, you know. I mean, there was a long time when it didn't seem, well, either it didn't seem that it was going to end, or it didn't seem that it was going to end well, you know. I mean, there's somebody showed me a clip of an old news interview that I did back in those days, and somebody asked me if I would ever write about it, you know, and I said, well, I don't know how to write about it because I don't know the last chapter, you know, and for a long time it seemed that the last chapter might not be a very pleasant one, you know, and in which case it might not have been I who would have had to write the book, you know. And then there was the other problem, which is the one you say, which is just the kind of unendingness, you know, it just might just go on all the time, you know, and yeah, I mean, that was some of the hardest stuff. But I mean, I think what happened is that I just decided to try and make sure that wasn't going to happen. I mean, I just tried to fight back against it as hard as I could. And once I began, with the help of many other people, to have this kind of political campaign against the fatwa, and we began to be able to meet with government leaders and try and, you know, gather support and so on. I mean, that felt better. It feels better when you're fighting back than when you're sitting passively in a corner hoping that, you know, the bomb doesn't drop on you. So that helped. I mean, just being active in the matter, you know, helped. And then eventually, I mean, I think one of the great things about, it's also one of the worst things about the age we live in, is that, you know, is ADD. You know, the subject changes very quickly. You know, that no matter how heated the subject is, there's a moment when the heat goes out of it, you know, and people have other fish to fry. And I think that's part of the reason why in the end it was solved. You know, just I think everybody concerned, including the Iranians, you know, ended up having other fish to fry and just wanted to get this out of the way. It felt like ancient history. And that made a political settlement possible, you know, just because there's a change in the mood. You know, it certainly was, I was helped a great deal by the election of sympathetic governments both in the United States and England. That's to say the Clinton administration here and the Blair government in England, who both became much more proactive in this matter than was the case when there was the first was the senior Bush administration and the Thatcher and then Major governments in England. They were not nearly so active in the matter. So yeah, I mean, in the end, there was a political settlement, you know, but took 12 years. And I remember when it began, everybody thought it would take like 12 days. You know, nobody thought it was going to go on for a long time. It seemed so outrageous, you know, that the head of one country should order the murder of the citizen of another country who was living in his own country and had committed no crime in that country. You know, how can this happen? It's impossible. You know, it's going to get fixed. Leave it to the diplomats, leave it to the politicians. There's going to be conversations. It'll be fixed. That's what everybody thought. You know, and it took 12 years.
One last one.
Yes, sir.
My question is actually about innovation. You know, that's a term that you use almost applied to every field these days. So I would like to know your views on, is that a discussion that happens, you know, especially in the field of writing, imagination, and storytelling at large? And really, what does innovation mean, you know, and do you see that happening in the future? But general discussion around it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there are writers for whom it's not a big subject. You know, there are writers who are very content with the form as it exists, you know, and are able to use it to great effect, you know. But I think, for me, the interesting work, both in terms of what I want to read and what I want to write, is stuff which does try to push boundaries, you know. And that, it seems to me, is the real risk of a work of art. You know, you go to the edge and push. And if you look at the history of literature, the greatest writers have been the ones who tried to do that. They tried. In fact, one of the big recurring themes of the Satanic Verses, a sentence that recurs throughout the novel, is how does newness enter the world, you know? And it doesn't always enter the world just because somebody has an idea that nobody else has had, you know? Much more characteristically, certainly in the world of literature, newness is to do with a combination of things. It's to do with finding things in the past, adding something, and the combination of those things makes a third thing that is new, if you like, you know. And yeah, I think that's I mean, for me as a writer, it's very important to try and find a way. You know, the word novel means new, right. You know, and you want to be able to do new things, because otherwise, you know, there are already enough books. You know, if all of us who write were to stop writing today, there would be too many books, you know, and none of us would ever read in a lifetime all the great books that already exist to be read. None of us. So if you want to add to that mountain, you know, maybe you should have something new to say. Otherwise, it's been said 5,000 times before and probably better than you could. You know? So I'm very interested in the question of innovation in literature, yeah. It's not compulsory. You know, there's some of the most beautiful writing that exists is also very conventional. You know, but so in the end, it is temperamental. There are writers who are, as I say, content with the conventions and forms as they exist, and there are others who are not content. You know, but it's that latter school that tends to move it forward. You know, and many of the great literary movements that we can see of the last 100 years, starting with the modernist movement, going through, you know, surrealism, postmodernism, magic realism. You know, what was in America called fabulism. You know, many of these movements have been, the writers at the front of them have been the very best writers around. And they've been driven to find a new way of saying something. Because, to put it simply, the world changes, you know. The world changes now at a rate that it's never changed before, you know. And maybe the old ways are not the ways that fit anymore. So you have to find a way of telling stories that can respond to the changes in the world. You know? So,
thank you. Thank you so much, Salman. Well, I can say I can't wait for a Never Knew Ever Knew novel from Salman Rushdie. So we'll be lined up for that. And next week, there's a panel discussion with Professor Rushdie on Midnight's Children 2.0, which is the film version of the novel that has won the Booker of Bookers, and continues to be read and celebrated. We hope you'll see you there.
And Deepa will be here. Deepa Mehta will be here.
Deepa Mehta will be here.
And I should
David
also
Hamilton.
say, because she won't, that Deepika is a little bit involved in this film, because we had to translate the dialogue into a number of Indian languages, and here's our translator.
Thank you very much, Salman.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.